So the first half of today's lecture will be, just kind of roughly Lenin, the formative years, and then since it's so late, I'm probably thinking, depending on how late this runs, maybe we'll just hold off on questions till next time, since we're going to pick up next time to the second half. And second half will be more nuts and bolts of what you could call Leninism. But so born in 1870, Vladimir raised in a home environment that was relative to the time and locale, contextually liberal. I'll explain what I mean by that. Vladimir's parents were adamantly loyal to the Tsarist regime and the opportunities for status climbing which that political loyalty afforded them, and also other highly educated members of Russia's extremely small middle class. And in this sense, Vladimir's parents were, of course, conservative. However, they fancied themselves as part of an educated, cultured segment of Russian society which took its cues, however ameliorated, from Enlightenment-era Europe and advocated moderate or liberal reforms within the political system of Tsarism, which they were hoping would hasten Russian comparability with Western Europe, economically, culturally, etc. So I refer to them as liberal because, for instance, they championed expanded access to public education and Tsar Alexander II's Emancipation Edict of 1861. And I'll do a little background on the Emancipation Edict of 1861. A century and a half before the Emancipation Edict of 1861, during the 18th century, Peter the Great had reinforced feudalism by forcibly tying peasants to their landed masters. And I'm coming mostly from this biography on Lenin by Robert Service, so I'll be quoting Service a lot in here. According to Service, a century and a half before the Emancipation Edict of 1861, educational standards were woeful, legal norms went unheeded, poverty was awesome, the Romanov police state banned political parties, trade unions, public protests, administrative arbitrariness was pervasive, and we probably all could guess that. So let's jump back to 1861, mid-19th century, a decade before Vladimir's birth. The Emancipation Edict of 1861, to be sure, did introduce marked reforms. However, the quality of life for the overwhelming majority of Russians, even after this edict, was still impoverished and subservient. Former serfs now eked out their subsistence as tenants. And I would argue the main difference here is a linguistic term applied to them, with marginal rights on small plots of land. These plots of land, although worked and inhabited by one familial generation to the next, were even after the Emancipation Edict of 1861, rarely owned outright by the new tenants, and the former compulsion to pay tributes under which they formerly suffered was replaced by the compulsion to render rents. And one kind of a crude example is also very near the same time the Emancipation Proclamation here in the United States of America, outlawing slavery in the early 1860s, and the return of former slaves, now tenants to their former masters' small plots of land, the high rents they had to pay, the minimal actual change in living conditions. And so a crude example can be our own Emancipation Proclamation. Service writes that after the Emancipation Edict of 1861, of which Lenin's parents were strong proponents, and that's why I characterize them as liberal, quote, there remained a massive gap between rich and poor. For instance, the legendarily rich Yusupov family had estates all over the country, land equivalent in size to small European countries, while the Russian peasantry, which made up the vast majority of Russian society still, were subject to arbitrary and capricious law, including floggings. This is after the Emancipation Edict. Vladimir's grandfather was a feudal lord over 40 families, from which peasants' rents would support Vladimir and his immediate and extended family until Vladimir's adulthood. Vladimir's father was first inspector, then director of popular schools, achieved a noblemanship that entitled him to be addressed by others as His Excellency, and was awarded the prestigious honor of the Order of Stalinov, First Class. And I point these out because this becomes really interesting in the historiography, because critics of Lenin will say, basically, he was royalty almost, like lower class royalty. And this is actually really inaccurate and not fair. They would be considered, notwithstanding that his father had achieved that rank, they would be considered part of the small middle class of Russian society at that time. His father still had a job as inspector of public schools, and that's how he achieved that status of nobleman. And so nobleman might be kind of a misnomer if we're thinking of something like British aristocracy. So they would be considered middle class. Let's see here. One of the things that Service points out is that and Lenin, of course, is not Vladimir's real name. That's a pseudonym he acquired later in life. So Vladimir's last name was Ulyanov. But one of the things that Service points out is the tight-knit nature of the relationship of the family, and this will come into play over and over again, and this will kind of develop as a theme. Vladimir's father, like I said, was director of popular schools, and they had a really studious regiment at home, long hours of studying, and Vladimir's older brother, Alexander, would go on to graduate top of his class. Vladimir would graduate top of his class. All of the kids did really well, and a lot was expected of them. As a kid, Vladimir was an admirer of Abraham Lincoln. Often, in make-believe games, played Northern troops. And his favorite book as a kid was actually the American book, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, actually. And if you guys remember from high school, she had written this novel, and she later met Lincoln during the Civil War, and Lincoln said something to the effect of, so this is the little lady that started this great big war, and I'm not sure actually if that's, I don't know if that's ever been confirmed, but that's the story that's been told for a long time. But that was his favorite book. His father died at 16, and it was a very patriarchal household, as was regular for the time in locale, and this shook the family up a lot. So he's 16, he's graduating from high school, top of his class. His father dies. His father dies kind of during what we would call finals month, and he still manages to graduate top of his class. He's 16 years old. I'm going to pause here and talk about Russian revolutionaries of the 1860s and 1870s, and kind of lay some groundwork here, because he has an older brother named Alexander, who is kind of this rising star, and is going to university. And like I said, he graduated top of his class, and is going to be a doctor, and all the hopes are placed on Alexander. And Alexander goes away to college and will become a revolutionary. And so I'll get into that in a minute, but I'll kind of lay some background about the Russian revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s. Okay. Service says, the dominant ideology of Russian revolutionaries during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s had been socialism, or in some cases anarchism. However, they were usually known as narodniki, roughly translatable as populist. It's not a straight translation, but roughly. However, there's two main factions within Russian revolutionary tendencies at the time that are going to become quite aggressive towards one another. And sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they don't get along at all. And it boils down to these qualitative differences that really are not going to be patched between what today we might refer to as anarchists and communists. But at the time, terms that were they kind of identified as Agrarian Socialists sometimes, versus Marx's influence, which was coming into Russia and was seen as a scientific communism for the industrial classes. And sometimes these differences were differences of emphasis, and sometimes, like I said, they were just pure qualitative differences that weren't going to be resolved. The first type, the Agrarian Socialists, were the older tendency. Chronologically speaking, they were the longer and the older tendency within Russian revolutionaries. And they emphasized the peasantry's customs of communal welfare, collective responsibility, and cooperation at work and at leisure should be the foundations for the good society. These new young upstart industrial, these revolutionaries that would emphasize the industrial nature of class warfare and and Marx's scientific analysis. This is a quote from Service. Found through bitter experience that workers were more responsive to revolutionary invocations than were the peasants. For instance, when a surge of students went out to effect revolutionary propaganda in the countryside in 1874, many of them had been turned over to the Ministry of Interior by astonished peasants, end quote. And so part of this debate comes down to a debate of efficacy and which class is going to be more responsive to the aims. Skip a part here just for a second. Okay. Some of this infighting, though, between the so-called agrarian socialists and those Marxists became so pronounced. Lenin had a friend that shot himself, actually, because the hyperbole between the two groups grew so intense that he felt like his reputation was slandered so much beyond repair that he could no longer live up to the expectations of his comrades, and he shot himself, and this affected Lenin. There's a character named Plekhanov, which I'm going to talk more about in the second lecture. He'll come into being. I'll talk more about him in the second lecture, but I'll talk a little bit about him right here, actually. And he figured prominently in this debate between the Agrarian Socialists and the Marxists. Does this build anticipation when I do this?
Quite.
Just frustration. Okay. Plekhanov maintained that the future of the revolution did not realistically lie with the peasant, the land commune, and the countryside. Plekhanov was a lapsed agrarian socialist. He became a convert to Marxism. Although he and Marx are going to have their differences later on, which I'll go into in the second lecture. He urged that success could no longer be achieved unless the clandestine groups recognized that Russia was undergoing an economic and social transformation. And this becomes a really important point of departure because, as you guys all know, Russia is economically and industrially much further behind than Western Europe. So hold on to that thought for a second. Railways were being laid to connect all the major cities, factories were being financed and constructed, mines were being sunk, foreign investment was being attracted into the country in pursuit of the quick, high profits available in an economy rich in natural resources and cheap, willing labor. It was no longer feasible, wrote Plekhanov, to dream of transforming Russia into a socialist society without at first undergoing the stage of capitalist development. Capitalism, he declared, had already arrived and had arrived in force. So this becomes a key component of this debate. Some are arguing on the one hand that Russia can actually skip right over capitalism. Others are arguing that that's just farcical and impossible, and we have to utilize capitalism as a stage in development on our way to socialism or communism. This becomes a key point, and one that Lenin will weigh in on later on, and I'll come back to that in a second. there was much controversy among the revolutionaries of the Russian Empire as to whether Plekhanov had got it right, that capitalism had in fact already arrived in Russia in force, and that we had to deal with it. There was no sense in going back to a utopian or idealized agrarian socialist society, that we had to implement capitalism as a tool. In 1881, Vera Zasulik, it's probably not how it's said at all, the Agrarian Socialist terrorist, wrote to Marx himself, asking whether he believed that the scheme of social development he had sketched out for the advanced capitalist states was necessarily applicable to agrarian Russia. And so this is a point of contention as Marx is being translated into Russian. People are asking, is his formula categorical in all societies, or, you know, taking into account different stages of development, could we possibly skip the stage of capitalism? In many of his works, Marx had analyzed how the capitalist stage came from the bowels of feudalism. So feudalism led to capitalism. He predicted that the internal process of capitalism would engender crisis after crisis, which in turn would induce the impoverished working class, equipped by capitalism itself with educational and organizational skills, to seize power. So that was the standard interpretation by many, was that capitalism was necessary. Thus the movement from feudalism to capitalism to socialism was not only desirable, it was inevitable. But, asked Vera Zasulik, was this sequence of stages predestined to affect every country? Might there not be a chance for a largely pre-capitalist country such as Russia to avoid capitalism altogether and to adopt socialism? The reply she received from Marx was gratifying. Far from claiming that capital offered a template for all countries, he accepted that Russia's agrarian economy and peasant communal traditions might allow it to have a socialist transformation without capitalist industrialization. And so in the polemics of the time, the apologists for both camps were using this to advance, the agrarian socialists are saying even Marx supports us, which is probably taking it a bit far. But thus he appeared to condone the strategy of the Russian agrarian socialists. And indeed, he and Engels were also known to admire the anti-Tsarist terrorists and to dismiss the self-proclaimed Marxists, such as Plekhanov, as bookish and cowardly. This is another point of contention among many of the Marxists and the agrarian socialists, is many of the agrarian socialists advocate terrorism, and many of the Marxists at the time are advocating organizing. Thus, the Russian controversy over capitalism between the agrarian socialists and the Marxists seemingly encouraged Marx to side with the agrarian socialists. But Marx was not quite so unequivocal as Zasulik claimed on the possibility of a socialist revolution being based on the egalitarian aspect of peasant land commune. He had specified that this would not be at all practical unless there were concurrent seizures of power by socialist parties in the advanced capitalist countries of the West. Meaning, at first glance, it appears that he's siding with the agrarian socialists. However, he makes the point that they're only going to be able to maintain that way of lifestyle in Russia if the other industrialized countries who already are processing capitalism are going to stand in international solidarity with them. And so at some point you have to be complicit with capitalism. I will leave it at that for right now. So that is the kind of milieu that Vladimir's older brother Alexander goes away to college in. And unbeknownst to his middle-class parents, Alexander takes up with revolutionaries in college and becomes barely unrecognizable. And they plot the assassination of the Tsar. And long story short, they're apprehended just before events are about to go down, and he is imprisoned. Alexander is imprisoned, and the family is shocked that he was even engaged in these conspiracies. They had no idea while he was away at college, and he is then hanged. And and the entire country knows about it, of course. And the Ulanov family now, they were climbing the social ladder previous to this, are now pariahs in the community and outcasts. And they just lost their father a year before. And it's noted that the treatment of the Ulanovs and of Vladimir specifically changes dramatically, whereas they were seen as the great hope of the community. All of a sudden, they're quite the inverse. And there's a teacher gives Ulanov kind of a review at the end of the year, and his teacher writes, so Vladimir graduates top of his class. He writes, Vladimir is extremely talented, consistently keen and accurate. In all classes, he was the top pupil, and at the end of his course was awarded the sole gold medal as the most deserving pupil in performance, development, and behavior. Neither at the gymnasia, which is kind of what they're referring to there as a preparatory academy, nor outside on any occasion did it ever come to light when Vladimir, by word or deed, attracted disapproving opinions from the governing authorities or teachers of the gymnasia. His parents always carefully supervised Ulanov's education and moral development. From 1886, after his father's death, this involved his mother, who concentrated every concern and care on the upbringing of the children. Religion and rational discipline laid the foundations of the education. And the teacher goes on to just like extol his virtues, except this is right after his brother Alexander has just been hung for treason. And so it takes a different turn towards the end of the review. His teacher says, I cannot but remark, though, on young Vladimir's excessive reclusiveness and on his self-distancing from intercourse, even with his acquaintances. And outside the gymnasia, even with schoolmates who were the greatest flower of the school. And on Vladimir's general unsociability. And so it goes on to characterize him in more and more demonic terms. And Service gets into the historiography here and says it was probably true that Lenin was what we call introverted today, but there was kind of a tactic of covering your ass by the teacher, who now it was everybody's responsibility to keep an eye out for the Ulanov family, and so everyone had to be the first to say, "I saw it coming," and to characterize them as unsocial and as having the warning, the red flags at every turn. And so they became socially ostracized in their community. But at this point, when his brother is hanged, according to most of the historiography, young Lenin has no concept of politics. The educational system there is extremely censored. And he has no concept of what his brother was into and was learning about. But within a year's time now, between the time his brother is hanged and within a year's time, by the time Lenin is 18, he will be a full-fledged revolutionary sympathizer, if not activist. Read this really fast. And one of the influences on young Lenin at this time will be an author named Chernyshevsky. Alexander left behind books and notes about this author named Chernyshevsky, and this is how young Lenin came across them, going through his dead brother's notes and books. When Vladimir talked later in life about coming across his brother's notes on Chernyshevsky, he acknowledged that Chernyshevsky, quote, plowed him over and over again, end quote. And then this also gets into just personal information about Lenin. Lenin continually is marked by not emphasizing aesthetics or giving up his aesthetic preferences as he gets older and older, his loves in life, chess, and, Beethoven, skating, and giving these up for revolutionary training and tasks at hand. Chernyshevsky was an odd writer to exercise such an impact, but this is very typical of Lenin. Chernyshevsky's prose was like a rash of needles. Sprawling verbiage was covered with densely overgrown constructions, and he seemed immune to the models offered by the great novelists of the mid-19th century Russia, such as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. But style was not what drew Vladimir to Chernyshevsky. Vladimir's admiration for Chernyshevsky was considerable, and I want to introduce these guys, Chernyshevsky and Plinkinov, because they'll come back later, especially Plinkinov. In 1864, the Ministry of the Interior banished Chernyshevsky as an irreconcilable opponent of the Romanov autocracy, forced to a forced labor camp in eastern Siberia. The Russian Empire, and we probably all know this, was so large it wasn't necessary to deport subversives from the country. They could just be kept in distant locales. Chernyshevsky, even in exile, refused to recant his opinions, and generally is considered to have been a former revolutionary agrarian socialist. But nevertheless, he was not an idealizer of the peasantry, nor did he espouse the rural life. This comes up over and over again as well in the debates between the agrarian socialists and the Marxists. It's kind of an affinity or a sympathy for certain classes. Chernyshevsky wanted cultural development to be speeded up in his country. He advocated industrialization. He demanded a democratic political system based upon universal suffrage. He supported women's rights. He opposed the discriminatory legislation affecting the non-Russian nations and ethnic groups. He advocated the creation of a classless society. And so all of these would go on to influence Lenin, actually even before he even gets deeply into Marx. And this is what's interesting about Chernyshevsky, though. Chernyshevsky and Marx corresponded often, and Marx started learning Russian actually to read Chernyshevsky. He differed with Chernyshevsky on certain issues, but admired him a lot. And so Lenin thought he was in good company to admire Chernyshevsky as well. And he kept a picture of Chernyshevsky in his wallet, actually. Lenin did. Lenin is barred from certain schools because of his brother's activities. He finally gets admitted into one. He decides, to everybody's surprise, he loved literature, and he decided to give up literature in order to study jurisprudence as his political ambitions started to grow. During his first year of college, Lenin will be expelled from college and arrested when a student revolt breaks out. The police report says that Lenin is charged with that, quote, active participation in the organization of revolutionary circles among the student youth of Kazan, where he was attending university. This, of course, brings a horrible strain on his mother, on his family. They saw Alexander hanged not too long before, and now they see young Lenin going down the same path. Lenin is put on kind of a loose house arrest and has to live with his mother, which irks him. And he's on condition of good behavior, is not sent to jail just yet. He's subject to constant police monitoring. Lenin hated the school system there so much because it was so authoritarian. Much of the resentment of Tsarist Russia actually formulated within the university system among the students. And maybe that's not surprising to us. Lenin applied to do independent study in college and to do his jurisprudence degree by himself rather than going to university. And he went and took the exam after studying on his own, and again, graduated top of his class, beating out all the other university students who were admitted into the program. This is just coincidentally, Vladimir's older sister, Olga, dies of typhoid fever on the 4-year anniversary of their brother Alexander's hanging. This was hard on the family. Eventually, Lenin does get rearrested, and he goes to prison for his activities. I'm trying to do a quick version here. 1895, he's 25 years old. The police show up at his door and take him into custody. He's placed in cell number 193 in the House of Preliminary Detention. The circle of friends around him are also taken into custody, and so are some of his siblings. He spent 14 months in detention there. He treated the time there, quote unquote, as a political sabbatical, reading voraciously. He had previously prepared coded communication with his colleagues so that he or they could communicate in just such an instance. One of those methods was milk ink, which they wrote on. After 14 months of imprisonment, Lenin and his circle of friends, they were part of a group called the Union, the St. Petersburg Union of Struggle at the time. They were all sent to 3 years exile in Siberia. Lenin, however, petitions on behalf of his poor health and is sent to a place that's a little bit nicer. It's called the Italian Siberia, or Siberian Italy. It has nicer weather. And he had a case of nerves his whole life and anxiety. While he's banished to exile, though, his younger brother Dmitry and his sister Maria are separately arrested for revolutionary activities. And it seems that all the Yuvanov children are following in their older brother's footsteps. Let's see. I'm going to close on a note of Lenin and female romantic interests because we're all getting tired. And then we'll do part 2 next week. So by age 25, either Lenin had no female romantic interests, or a sense of decorum or hagiography prevented these from being recounted. But while he was in exile, he's now 27, suddenly he becomes engaged to a fellow Marxist revolutionary named Nadezhda Krupskaya, and I'm sure I pronounced that just perfectly, so just accept that, who is currently serving a separate exile. Lenin and Krupskaya had been friends before the respective exiles, but the plan was, once they got engaged, they hoped to be transferred to the same camp of exile. And they were. And I'm going to read this quote here really fast because it's really interesting. And then I'll close with him in exile. This is to expound a little bit on some of the romantic notions that Lenin and his circle of friends had about regarding a romantic love. Some have written of him that this arranged marriage in the camps was just a matter of facility so that he could transfer another Marxist revolutionary to his camp. But many in the circle quote, "The point is that romantic love, where a man and woman fall passionately in love, was not a condition to which either Vladimir or Nadezhda aspired," his fiancée. Both wrote little about their feelings for each other. But after Vladimir's death, Nadezhda wrote a furious letter in 1927 to Bolshevik Party historian Vladimir Sorin about the kind of relationship that they had enjoyed, approval among Marxist revolutionaries of their generation. She strenuously opposed Sorin's suggestion that such revolutionaries fell hopelessly in love with each other. She said they consciously rejected contemporary bourgeois attitudes to matters of the heart and instead aimed to construct a new way of life, and they supposed that their own relationship should be focused upon working collaboratively for the cause of revolution. For them, the idea of a permanent marital union had distasteful connotations: tradition, religion, economic self-interest, and the subjection of the wife to the husband. Russian Marxists, as Nadezhda pointed out, were keener than their counterparts elsewhere in Europe to form loose partnerships for the greater good of the cause. So take that for what it's worth. And if you guys have any questions, but I think we could probably hold off until next time. We'll come back to Planktonov, to the Agrarian Socialists, and to the nuts and bolts of Leninism. Go for it.
It is worth noting, however, I don't know if you're going to touch on this. One of the main reasons, right, you often hear that Lenin, hated Stalin at the end of his life. One of the main reasons he disliked Stalin is because Stalin swore at his wife. So, I mean, not to necessarily undercut the position, But right, one of the big cores of his political break with Stalin was that Stalin was very rude to his wife, and in fact, he wrote his testament to the Central Committee, not saying about his wife, but saying that Stalin should not have the position of General Secretary because he literally, this was literally in there, was too rude.
Wait, whose wife? Lenin's wife or Stalin's?
Lenin's wife. Stalin swore at Lenin's wife. What is it? Norodskaya? What's her name?
I don't know. I pronounced it like 8 different ways.
But again, not to undercut.
No, but I agree with you, and I think that was her point that she wrote to that historian later on. She said, we were trying to redefine the nature of relationships, but we were very much in love.
All right.